Welcome back, Zedheads. We continue on with more Dane Rudhyar today, and this week we are looking at the 8 different lunation types of personality. I think most of us are very familiar with the 4 basic phases: the new moon, first quarter, full moon, and last quarter. But the synodic cycle is actually defined by an 8-phase system, if you will. And this is often really overlooked in astrological interpretation. And if we plug into it, it can really give added information about the individual in regards to their personality, how they operate in the world. If we remember that the lunation cycle is actually that dynamic interplay between the 2 luminaries in the sky, Dane argues that we can't always see where in the ecliptic Uranus is, for example. We have to follow a pretty lengthy process of space-time sidereal calculation to work this out. However, a glance in the sky at night, weather permitting obviously, can enable us to readily discern where we are within that cycle, and more importantly, attune ourselves to the great rhythm of life, the sun-moon relationship, which, in his words, is imprinted indelibly upon the electromagnetic field of our total psychosomatic being. Pretty important. And whenever the lunar phase returns to that which we were born under, we return externally to the energetics of relating, which are imprinted upon us internally at the time of birth. So if you're curious to know more about how your lunar phase affects you, or you simply want to fall asleep, we are going to now get into these 8 phases. We'll discuss their degrees as we go along and how they leave that mark upon the soul, at least during this lifetime. So, as ever, get yourself comfortable, turn on, tune in, and drop out. The 8 types. The new moon type. This will include all persons born exactly at the new moon, or within about 3½ days following the new moon. Thus the moon is less than 45 degrees ahead of the sun. This type of person tends to be eminently subjective, impulsive, and emotional in his responses to human relationship and social processes. This may produce a state of confusion, a tendency to project oneself upon others and the world at large, to live life and love as if they were dreams or screens upon which to cast one's image, and often one's shadow. People and situations are met in most cases without much regard to what they actually are in themselves. They become symbols. Sigmund Freud and Karl Marx are typical examples. So, in another sense, were Woodrow Wilson and Queen Victoria, who sought to impress their ideals and personal characters upon the world. The Queen became identified with an era and its mores in matters of human relationship. Other examples are the Persian prophet the Bab, who in 1844 ushered in a new religious era and experienced martyrdom. Amos Bronson Alcott, the transcendentalist, well known for his subjective idealism and spiritual youthfulness. Clara Barton, founder of the American Red Cross, a woman of intense vital energy and subjective vision, fired with one basic soul purpose. Ludwig Erhard, who succeeded in reviving German industry and finances. Gamal Nasser, head of a reborn Egypt. The Crescent type. All persons born with the moon from 45 to 90 degrees ahead of the sun in the zodiac. Here we see the new impulse for action, or quality of activity, theoretically released at the new moon as it challenges the old in a more or less intense struggle. This leads usually to self-assertiveness, faith in oneself, and an eagerness to overcome obstacles in carrying out an inwardly felt command or vital urge. As every type has its negative aspect, this crescent type may be characterized in some cases by a deep subconscious sense of being overwhelmed by the momentum of the past and the power of ghosts or karma. This negative feeling comes as the result of a failure to repolarize one's capacity for personal or social relationship. The unfortunate French king, Louis XVI, typifies the negative aspect. Among positive representatives of the type, we can list Ralph Waldo Emerson, who sought to bring new spiritual and existential values to his New England culture. Franz Liszt, who succeeded in changing the social status of musicians and in challenging traditional music concepts, yet felt the need to return to the church of his troubled adolescence. Andrew Carnegie, the steel magnate whose foundation became a model for many similar projects. Louisa May Alcott, the author of Little Women, and President John Kennedy. First quarter type. All persons born with the moon from 90 to 135 degrees ahead of the sun, i.e. from 7 to 10.5 days after the new moon. This represents in the lunation cycle a time of crisis in action, a time for managerial, forceful activity. The essential drive in the person is the building of frameworks which may serve for the future objectivation of new social ideals and of a new sense of interpersonal relationship. A strong will is usually present in the positive instance of the type, and perhaps a feeling of self-exaltation when faced with crumbling old structures, and the, at times, ruthless attempt at consolidating the new ideal. Joseph Stalin and Oliver Cromwell, also Howard Scott of technocratic fame, or positive types. The French poet Baudelaire is a negative instance, yet a remarkable manager of words. The Russian composer Shostakovich and President Charles de Gaulle, tenaciously intent upon building a new France, belong also to this type, and so does perhaps less characteristically Queen Elizabeth of England, though her country may see a new attempt at rebuilding itself within the framework of a future Europe. Gibbous moon type. All persons born with the moon 135 to 180 degrees ahead of the sun, thus a few days before full moon. These persons tend to pay much attention to the development of their capacity for personal growth. They desire to contribute value and meaning to their society, their culture, or in general to life. They ask repeatedly, why? They work toward a clarification of personal or social cultural issues with some kind of, to them, important goal in view. They generally have keen minds and a capacity to associate ideas and concepts, seeking thereby to make possible some kind of revelation or illumination. They may wish to devote themselves to a great personality or cause, and want others to work for them with the same devotion. Amongst men of that type, one finds the unorthodox and brilliant German philosopher Count Hermann Kaiserling, the inspired mystic Jacob Boehm, Lord Byron, and composer Gershwin, who gave a new distinction to popular music. Among scientists, Newton and Pasteur can be mentioned. The great international banker J.P. Morgan, and presumably Napoleon I, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Khrushchev also belong to this type. Full moon type. All persons born at full moon time and during the 3.5 days which follow. The moon is therefore from 180 to 135 degrees behind the sun in the zodiac, and, we might say, racing to meet the sun. This is the first of the types belonging to the waning hemicycle of the Solly lunar cycle, and it carries out the symbolical meaning of the full moon, the apex of the cycle. Objectivity and clear consciousness as the result of interpersonal and social cultural relationships are, theoretically, the basic factors in character. The original impulse of the lunation cycle, its fundamental ever-sounding tone, has now become a formed concept, a more or less clear image. What was mainly felt in the past is now seen. This may mean a revelation or illumination, and normally some kind of fulfillment. But it can also mean negatively separation or divorce, perhaps even a divorce from reality or inner division, man against himself, or woman against herself. Relationship means everything to the person of the full moon type, or else he repudiates all relationships, except perhaps those with an ideal or absolute character. Mary Baker Eddy, prophet of Christian Science, is an excellent example of what has just been said. In the nearly opposite sense, we have the Apollonian thinker Goethe, and Rudolf Steiner, the occultist seer, also a fervent admirer of Goethe. Joan of Arc is another visionary example of the type, prophet of a united France and of modern nationalism. The Hindu spiritual wayfarer, Krishnamurti, presumably belongs to this character of personality, but so does the Spanish dictator Franco and the astrologer Evangeline Adams. Disseminating type. All persons born with the waning moon from 135 to 90 degrees behind the sun in the zodiac. This is also a gibbous moon, astronomically speaking, but pointing to a direction opposite to that of the gibbous moon belonging to the waxing hemicycle. I use the term disseminating because in the positive sense, such a person tends to want to demonstrate to others what he or she has learned or experienced. Thus, an individual of that type often acts as a disseminator of ideas, as a popularizer of what has impressed them most forcibly in their studies or experiences in their tradition. They may become a real crusader, but the negative type can easily be lost in a cause and develop fanaticism or be swayed by mass emotions. Among statesmen, this disseminating type is represented by Jefferson, Disraeli, Teddy Roosevelt, Bismarck, and Hitler, Among thinkers and artists, we find in this category Carl Jung, and before him, Dante and Wagner. Last quarter type. All persons born with the waning moon from 90 to 45 degrees behind the sun. While the first quarter type represents basically a state of crisis in action, this last quarter type is essentially characterized by a tendency to experience crisis in consciousness. At least what seems mainly important to these persons is the embodiment of their ideological beliefs in definite systems of thought and/or concrete institutions. In personal as well as social relationships, they tend to force issues on the basis of some more or less important principle, which they feel they must uphold, perhaps at all costs. They may lack flexibility, as they often consider themselves pioneers whose work only posterity will appreciate. They are geared to a future of which, however, they only see the structural outline or prenatal glow. In some cases, they are able to display an irony or sense of humour which they put at the service of their cause, or else they are unable to take criticism. To this type belong reformers like Luther and Gandhi, statesmen such as Washington, Lenin, Trotsky, Mussolini, the apostle of the single tax movement, Henry George, the humanitarian poet Victor Hugo, the scientist Einstein, and the humorist George Bernard Shaw can be added as significant examples of this type. Balsamic moon type. All persons born with the moon less than 45 degrees behind the sun, thus about 3.5 days before new moon. This is symbolized by the inverted lunar crescent seen before sunrise, thus announcing, as it were, the new day. The approximately 3 days of this balsamic, solely lunar relationship represents 1/10 of the whole lunation cycle. In the old Hindu doctrine of cycles, the last 10th part of a cycle, and, but not quite as significantly so, the first 10th of the next, constitute a transition state, and we might say also the seed state. In these last 3 days of the lunation cycle of 30 days, the cycle, as it were, comes to seed. And this seed is to become the foundation of the future plant, provided conditions for germination are adequate. This type of personality is, in its highest manifestations, prophetic and completely turned toward the future, even though it feels itself the end product of the past, yet a past which outwardly or consciously it has left behind. At times the individual feels himself possessed by a social destiny or led by a superior power. He is more or less aware of being a kind of shrine or field within which something greater than his personal selfhood is taking place. Thus, he may readily accept sacrifice or martyrdom for the sake of the future, be it the future of a small group or of humanity as a whole. He tends to sense a character of finality in all important relationships he experiences. That is, he sees them both as ends of some process and as means to reach some transcendental goal. This may lead to fanaticism, as in the case of the French revolutionist Robespierre, who initiated the cult of the goddess Reason, or to great political vision, as in Thomas Paine, surnamed rightly the father of democracy, and in Lincoln, the emancipator. The philosopher Kant, Havelock Ellis, student of the end results and perversions of the sexual drives, Cecil Rhodes, who had a vision of an African empire, President McKinley, under whose administration the United States began to operate in the field of international politics as a world power with immense potentialities for leadership, and who was killed in office, and Pope Paul VI, born just before New Moon, and who revolutionized a good many things in his church. These men belong to the Balsamic type. In applying the above characterizations of the 8 lunation types, one must evidently consider first of all the limitations imposed upon an individual by his social environment, his culture, etc. It matters little whether we deal with a statesman who dies a martyr to the political cause he has espoused, or with a teacher of a small rural school, perhaps in an undeveloped region, whose life becomes utterly consecrated to raising the level of education of the village's children. What counts is the quality of the relationships entered upon by the person in question, the manner in which his or her life of personal, social, cultural relationship is polarized, and thus the nature of the contribution the individual makes to his community or nation. This 8-fold classification of lunation types does not, however, fill all the requirements of a thorough analysis of personality, and it should be supplemented by another kind of astrological approach to the lunation cycle. This approach leads us to the study of what is called the part of fortune, and in general to a consideration of the real meaning of the so-called Arabian parts, which we will, of course, discuss another time. If you're still with me, well done. And if you're asleep, night-night, sweet dreams, and I'll see you again soon.